The garage smelled like motor oil and broken dreams. I was underneath my '89 Mustang, wrench in hand, when I heard Elara's voice cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. She was on speaker, probably pacing around her glass-walled office that overlooked our perfectly manicured lawn. "Logan, the quarterly projections are solid. We just need to finalize the board restructure before the IPO announcement." Her voice carried that cold precision I'd once found attractive. Now it just reminded me of winter mornings, beautiful but unforgiving. I slid out from under the car, wiping grease from my hands with an old rag. Through the garage window, I could see her silhouette in that office, gesturing with the same hands that used to touch my face when she laughed at my jokes. That was before I became just another line item on her corporate balance sheet. The Mustang had been my father's. Elara called it a rust bucket, but I called it honest. Unlike everything else in our lives, it didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. The engine was original, the paint was fading, and the seats had character marks from decades of real living. It was the only thing in our driveway that hadn't been chosen by committee or purchased to impress the neighbors. "Dad, Mom wants to know if you're coming to dinner." Riley appeared in the doorway, her phone glued to her hand like a technological appendage. At 16, she'd inherited her mother's sharp features and sharper tongue. She made reservations at that new place downtown, the one with the Instagram-worthy desserts. "Tell your mother I'll be up in a minute." I turned back to the engine, adjusting a belt that didn't really need adjusting. "Just finishing up here. She also said to remind you that the Hendersons are joining us. You know, the ones with the lake house? Mom thinks you might want to wear something that doesn't smell like a mechanic's shop." The Hendersons? Of course. Another couple from Elara's corporate circle. Another evening of polite conversation about market trends and vacation homes in places I'd never visit. I used to try to fit into those conversations, back when I thought being part of Elara's world meant she'd stay part of mine. "Riley, tell me something. When did your old man become such an embarrassment?" She looked up from her phone for exactly 3 seconds. "Dad, you're not embarrassing. You're just different. Mom operates on a different level now. The company's about to go public, and she's got to maintain appearances. You know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. I'd helped build that company from nothing, back when Elara and I worked 18-hour days in a rented office space that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs. I'd written the initial business plan on our kitchen table while she handled the technical development. We were partners then, in every sense of the word. "Different level," I repeated, tasting the words like sour milk. "Right." Riley shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Dad, I didn't mean it like that. It's just that Mom's under a lot of pressure right now. The IPO, the board meetings, all that corporate stuff. Maybe if you showed more interest in her work." "I built half that company, kiddo. I think I've shown plenty of interest." "That was years ago, Dad. Things change. People grow." People grow. Another way of saying people grow apart, or people outgrow other people. I'd heard variations of this theme for months now, usually delivered with the kind of gentle condescension reserved for elderly relatives who don't understand smartphones. I closed the hood and gathered my tools. The garage had become my sanctuary, the one place in our sprawling suburban home where I could think clearly. Elara had redesigned everything else: the kitchen with its marble countertops and professional-grade appliances we never used, the living room with furniture that looked like modern art but felt like sitting on concrete, the master bedroom with its minimalist aesthetic that somehow managed to drain all warmth from the space. "Tell your mother I'll be right there," I said, heading toward the house. "Just need to clean up." The shower in our guest bathroom had better water pressure than the master suite, another small rebellion that Elara had stopped commenting on months ago. As I scrubbed the grease from my fingernails, I caught myself in the mirror, still in decent shape at 38, still had most of my hair, still looked like the guy who'd convinced a brilliant software engineer to take a chance on love and startups. The restaurant was exactly what I'd expected: exposed brick walls, Edison bulb lighting, and a menu that described every dish like it was performance art. The Hendersons were already seated when we arrived, Brad in his perfectly tailored suit, and Margaret with her tennis bracelet catching the light every time she gestured. "Kellan!" Brad stood to shake my hand with the enthusiasm of a man who'd practiced the motion in front of a mirror. "Great to see you. Elara's been telling us about the company's latest developments. Exciting times." "Exciting," I agreed, taking my seat across from him. That's one word for it. Elara shot me a look that could have frozen the wine. "Kellan's been focusing on some personal projects lately. Haven't you, honey?" The word honey came out like she was identifying a stain on expensive fabric. I smiled and ordered a beer, ignoring the server's subtle suggestion that perhaps I'd prefer to see their wine list. "Personal projects?" Margaret leaned forward with the predatory interest of someone who collected gossip like vintage handbags. How fascinating. What kind of projects? I'm restoring a 1989 Mustang, I said. Original engine, factory specifications. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you focus on the fundamentals. Brad nodded with the kind of polite enthusiasm reserved for children's art projects. Classic cars, that's a great hobby. Very grounding. Grounding. Another word that sounded like a compliment, but felt like a pat on the head. I took a long drink of my beer and watched Elara explain the company's expansion plans with the kind of passionate detail she used to reserve for describing our future together. The IPO should value us at around $200 million, she was saying. Of course, that's conservative. Logan thinks we could see 300 if the market conditions stay favorable. Logan March, our chief operating officer and Elara's former college classmate. Logan with his MBA from Wharton and his collection of expensive watches. Logan, who joined the company 6 months ago and somehow become Elara's most trusted advisor on everything from market strategy to restaurant recommendations. Logan certainly seems to have his finger on the pulse, I said. Amazing how quickly he's become indispensable. Elara's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Logan brings a fresh perspective. Sometimes you need an outside voice to see the bigger picture. An outside voice. I'd been hearing a lot about Logan's perspectives lately. His thoughts on corporate restructuring, his insights into market positioning, his recommendations for everything from office furniture to vacation destinations. For someone who'd been with the company for 6 months, Logan March had certainly made himself comfortable. The conversation drifted to safe topics: the weather, local politics, the Hendersons' upcoming trip to Europe. I played my part, nodding at appropriate intervals and making the kind of small talk that lubricates social machinery. But part of my mind kept wandering back to that watch I'd found in our laundry basket last week. It was a Rolex Submariner, expensive and distinctive, with an inscription on the back that read, LM, time to succeed. I'd never seen it before, and when I asked Elara about it, she'd claimed it belonged to a client who'd left it after a dinner meeting. The explanation was plausible enough, but something about her delivery felt rehearsed. Kellan, you seem distracted tonight, Margaret observed. Everything all right? Just thinking about work, I said. You know how it is. The mind never really stops. That's the curse of the entrepreneur, Brad agreed. Always thinking 3 moves ahead. Though I suppose with the IPO coming up, you must be feeling pretty good about things. Early retirement, maybe? Time to focus on those classic cars? Early retirement. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. I looked at Elara, who was studying her wine glass with unusual intensity. We haven't really discussed post-IPO plans, I said carefully. There's still a lot of work to be done. Of course, Brad continued, but surely you've thought about stepping back, letting the next generation take the reins. Sometimes the best thing a founder can do is know when to pass the torch. Pass the torch. Know when to step back. Let the next generation take the reins. The language of corporate succession, delivered with the casual brutality of people who'd never built anything from scratch. Brad raises an interesting point, Elara said, finally looking up from her wine. The company's at a stage where it needs different leadership skills, more strategic thinking, less hands-on management. Different leadership skills, I repeated. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning the kind of experience Logan brings, the ability to think beyond the technical details and focus on the broader market opportunities. There it was. Logan again. Logan with his strategic thinking and his broader market opportunities and his expensive watch that somehow ended up in our laundry. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a recognition that had been building for weeks, but which I'd been too stubborn or too hopeful to acknowledge. Well, I said, raising my beer in a mock toast, here's to strategic thinking and broader market opportunities, and to knowing when it's time to pass the torch. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful silences. Riley spent most of the meal documenting her dessert for social media, while the adults discussed property values and investment strategies. I found myself studying Elara's face, looking for traces of the woman who used to stay up all night coding while I handled the business side of things. She was still beautiful, more polished now, with professional styling and expensive skincare, but fundamentally the same features I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. The difference was in her eyes. They used to look at me like I was part of the solution. Now they looked through me like I was part of the problem. The drive home was quiet, except for the sound of Riley's fingers tapping against her phone screen. Elara stared out the passenger window, probably thinking about tomorrow's board meeting or next week's investor presentation. I focused on the road, on the familiar route through our neighborhood, with its perfect lawns and its perfect houses hiding their imperfect secrets. "Good dinner," I said as we pulled into our driveway. "The Hendersons seem to enjoy themselves," Elara replied. "Margaret mentioned they might be interested in investing when we open the next round." "Great. More strategic partners?" She looked at me sharply. "Is there something you want to say, Kellan?" I turned off the engine and sat in the darkness of our garage. Riley had already disappeared into the house, probably to continue her digital social life. It was just the two of us, sitting in the space between what we used to be and whatever we were becoming. "Just wondering when I became the liability instead of the asset," I said. "You're not a liability. You're just comfortable. And comfort can be dangerous in a competitive market." Comfortable. Another word that sounded like a compliment but felt like a diagnosis. I got out of the car and walked toward the house, leaving Elara to follow or not follow as she chose. The house felt different when I walked through it now, less like a home and more like a stage set designed to impress visitors. The family photos on the mantelpiece told the story of our evolution from struggling entrepreneurs to successful suburbanites, but they felt like evidence from someone else's life. I poured myself a whiskey and sat in my study, the one room Elara hadn't redesigned. My desk still held the original business plan we'd written together, along with photos from the early days when success meant landing a client big enough to cover rent for 3 months. Through the window, I could see Elara in her office, still on the phone despite the late hour. Her gestures were animated, excited in a way I hadn't seen directed toward me in months. I wondered if she was talking to Logan, sharing insights about market opportunities and strategic directions. The whiskey burned just enough to remind me I was still alive, still capable of feeling something besides the numb acceptance that had become my default mode. I opened my laptop and stared at the screen, not sure what I was looking for, but knowing I needed to find something. Elara's laptop was still logged into the company network. We'd shared passwords for years, back when transparency was a cornerstone of our relationship. I wondered if she'd changed them, if she'd started keeping secrets that required digital locks. I tried her usual password, Queen Bee Nech. A joke from our early days when she'd called herself that after closing a particularly difficult client. The system accepted it immediately, opening a window into communications I wasn't supposed to see. The email thread was dated from this afternoon, a conversation between Elara and Logan about tomorrow's board meeting. Nothing unusual there, just routine corporate planning. But as I scrolled through their recent exchanges, I noticed something that made my whiskey taste like ashes. The tone was different, intimate, personal in ways that went beyond professional collaboration. References to dinners I didn't know about, inside jokes I wasn't part of, a familiarity that spoke of time spent together outside the conference room. One message made me stop scrolling entirely. "Looking forward to continuing our conversation tonight. Same place as last week. L. Absolutely. And K is working on his car again, so we'll have plenty of time. E." The timestamp showed it was sent 3 hours ago, while we were having dinner with the Hendersons, while Elara was explaining to them how Logan's fresh perspective was exactly what the company needed. I closed the laptop and finished my whiskey in one burning gulp. Outside, Elara was still on her phone, still gesturing with excitement about whatever strategic opportunities were keeping her up past midnight. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, noting how she'd rearranged the furniture again, creating more space between his side and her side of the bed. The master bathroom held 2 sets of everything, toothbrushes, skincare products, towels, like a hotel suite designed for strangers who happened to be sharing space. I lay in bed listening to the sound of Elara's voice drifting up from her office, too distant to make out words, but close enough to hear the warmth that used to be reserved for conversations with me. The ceiling fan turned lazy circles overhead, marking time in a house that felt less like home with every passing hour. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I heard her car start in the driveway. I went to the window and watched her taillights disappear down our street, heading toward whatever conversation couldn't wait until morning. She didn't come home until dawn. The coffee was cold by the time Elara walked through the kitchen door, her hair perfectly styled despite supposedly working all night. She moved through our morning routine like an actress who'd memorized her blocking, coffee from the machine, yogurt from the refrigerator, glance at her phone, polite inquiry about my plans for the day. "You were up late," I said, not looking up from the newspaper I wasn't actually reading. "Conference call with the Tokyo office. Time zones, you know how it is." She delivered the lie with the casual confidence of someone who'd been practicing. Logan thought it would be better to handle it directly, rather than waiting for email exchanges. Logan thought. Logan suggested. Logan recommended. I was starting to think Logan had opinions about everything from corporate strategy to the weather forecast. "Productive call?" "Very. We're expanding the Asian market presence faster than projected. Logan's contacts over there are proving invaluable. Of course they were. Logan's contacts, Logan's insights, Logan's invaluable contributions to every aspect of our business. I wondered if Logan had contacts for marriage counseling too, or if that fell outside his area of expertise. Riley wandered into the kitchen wearing the kind of outfit that cost more than my first car, already documenting her breakfast for whatever social media platform was currently demanding her attention. She'd inherited her mother's instinct for presentation. Every meal was a photo opportunity, every moment a chance to craft the perfect online persona. "Dad, can you drive me to school today? Mom's got that big meeting with the investors." "Sure, kiddo." I folded the newspaper and stood up. "Ready when you are." The drive to Riley's private school took us through the part of town where Elara and I used to live, back when success meant affording a 2-bedroom apartment without roommates. The old neighborhood looked smaller now, more worn around the edges, but somehow more honest than our current zip code. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Riley was looking out the window instead of at her phone, which meant whatever was coming was serious. "Shoot." "Are you and Mom having problems?" The question hit like a punch to the solar plexus. I kept my eyes on the road, buying time to figure out how to answer honestly without destroying whatever innocence she had left about her parents' marriage. "Why do you ask?" "She talks about you differently now, like you're a problem that needs to be solved instead of her husband." Smart kid. Too smart for her own good, probably. I pulled into the school's circular drive and put the car in park. "Your mom and I are going through some changes," I said carefully. "Sometimes when people build something together, they grow in different directions." "Is that why she's always with Logan now?" There it was, the question I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Riley might spend most of her time staring at screens, but she wasn't blind to what was happening in her own house. "Logan's helping with the company transition. It's business, Riley." She looked at me with the kind of expression that suggested she'd inherited her mother's ability to see through convenient explanations. "Dad, I'm 16, not 6. I know what business looks like, and I know what other stuff looks like too." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that her mother would never betray our family, that Logan was just a colleague with good timing and expensive taste in watches. But the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. "Whatever happens between your mom and me, it's not your fault, and it doesn't change how we feel about you." That's what parents always say right before they get divorced. She got out of the car and walked toward the school building without looking back. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, watching teenagers with their whole lives ahead of them, wondering when I'd become the kind of father who had to reassure his daughter that her family wasn't falling apart while knowing it probably was. The office felt different when I arrived. Subtle changes that might have been my imagination or might have been evidence of a corporate coup happening in slow motion. My parking space was still marked with my name, but someone had installed a new security system that required badge access to the executive floor. "Morning, Mr. Brooks." Janet, the receptionist, looked uncomfortable when she handed me a temporary badge. "There's been some updates to the access protocols. Ms. Brooks wanted to discuss it with you when you have a chance." Ms. Brooks. Not your wife or Elara, but the formal title that suggested professional distance. I clipped the temporary badge to my shirt and took the elevator to the executive floor, noting how the button required badge access now. The hallway outside my office buzzed with activity that stopped when I appeared. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, people suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, and the general atmosphere suggested I'd walked into a surprise party where I was the surprise. Logan emerged from the conference room, tablet in hand, looking like he'd been there since dawn. His shirt was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his smile had the practiced warmth of a politician greeting constituents. "Kellan, great timing. We were just reviewing the quarterly projections. Want to join us?" "In my own company? How generous." His smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Of course. I just meant we're at a good stopping point if you want to catch up on what we've covered." The conference room held the usual suspects, department heads, senior staff, and a few faces I didn't recognize. Elara sat at the head of the table, which used to be my spot during these meetings. She looked up when I entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Kellan, perfect. We were discussing the timeline for the IPO roadshow. Logan's put together some excellent projections for investor meetings." I took a seat halfway down the table, noting that my usual chair had been replaced with something slightly smaller and positioned to face the presentation screen rather than the rest of the room. Subtle, but effective, the visual language of diminished authority. "Logan's projections," I said. "How comprehensive?" "I think you'll find them quite thorough," Logan replied, advancing to the next slide. We're projecting a 30% increase in valuation based on the strategic restructuring we've implemented. Strategic restructuring. Another euphemism for changes I hadn't been consulted about. I listened as Logan outlined plans for expanding our workforce, opening new offices, and implementing management systems that sounded impressive but felt disconnected from the company I'd helped build. Questions? Logan asked when he finished his presentation. Just one, I said. When did we decide to restructure the equity distribution? The room went quiet. Elara's expression didn't change, but I caught a quick glance between her and Logan that spoke volumes. That's still under discussion, she said. We wanted to review all options before making any final decisions. Options that apparently don't require input from the co-founder? Kellan, perhaps we should discuss this privately, Elara suggested. I think the leadership team should hear this, I replied. After all, equity distribution affects everyone's future with the company. Logan cleared his throat. The board felt it was important to align ownership with operational responsibility. As the company grows, we need to ensure that decision-making authority matches current contributions. Current contributions. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I looked around the room at faces that had been friendly just 6 months ago, now carefully neutral and avoiding eye contact. I see, I said. And who's been determining these current contributions? The board established a committee, Elara said. Logan's been heading it up, given his experience with corporate transitions. Of course he had. Logan, with his experience and his strategic thinking and his ability to restructure companies in ways that somehow always benefited Logan. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, drawing a simple organizational chart. I co-founded this company, built the initial client base, developed our core business processes, and secured our first major contracts. Is that accurate? Nods around the room. So far, so good. And now, because I prefer hands-on management to strategic consulting, the board, led by someone who's been here 6 months, has decided my contributions don't justify my ownership stake. More uncomfortable silence. Logan shifted in his chair, his confident smile starting to look strained. Kellan, it's not personal, he said. Nah, it's about positioning the company for optimal growth. Optimal for whom? For everyone. The IPO will create value for all stakeholders. All stakeholders except the guy who built the foundation you're standing on. I capped the marker and set it down. The room felt smaller now, charged with the kind of tension that comes right before someone says something they can't take back. I think we should table this discussion, Elara said. Kellan, why don't you and I talk privately after the meeting? Actually, I think I've heard enough for now. I headed toward the door, then stopped and turned back. One more question, Logan. That's a nice watch you're wearing. Rolex Submariner, if I'm not mistaken. He glanced down at his wrist, where the same watch I'd found in our laundry was catching the conference room lighting. Thank you. It was a gift. From someone with excellent taste, I'm sure. I left them to their strategic planning and walked back to my office, which suddenly felt like a museum exhibit of my former relevance. The photos on my desk told the story of our company's growth. Early team meetings in cramped spaces, celebration dinners after major contract wins, the groundbreaking ceremony for our current building. In one photo, Elara and I stood together at our first industry conference, holding a Best Innovation Award we'd won for a product I'd designed and she'd coded. We looked young and hungry and completely united in our vision for what we could build together. I wondered when that unity had become a liability that needed strategic restructuring. My computer chimed with a new email from the IT department. Security protocol update. All executive access will be reviewed and updated by end of week. Please coordinate with your department head for new credential assignment. Department head. Not co-founder or executive team member, but the kind of language reserved for middle management positions that could be restructured at will. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the original partnership agreement Elara and I had signed 8 years ago. The language was clear. Equal ownership, equal authority, equal responsibility for major decisions. But legal documents were only as strong as the relationships they were meant to protect. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Brooks? Ms. Brooks would like to see you in her office when you have a moment. Her office. When had it stopped being our office, or the CEO office, or even just Elara's office? The possessive pronoun felt like another small step in a carefully choreographed dance designed to move me from partner to visitor. Elara's office had been redecorated since the last time I'd really looked at it. The furniture was more expensive, the artwork more sophisticated, and the overall effect more intimidating. She sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip, reviewing documents that she closed when I entered. Close the door, she said without looking up. I closed it and took the chair across from her desk, noting that it was positioned slightly lower than hers. Another subtle power dynamic that probably came straight from some executive leadership handbook. "We need to talk about what happened in there," she said. "You mean the part where I discovered my own company is being restructured without my knowledge, or the part where your strategic consultant is wearing the watch I found in our laundry basket?" Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. A calculation, a decision about how much truth the situation could handle. "Logan's watch is not relevant to this conversation. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty relevant to everything that's been happening around here." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for examining quarterly reports. "Kellan, I think you're letting personal feelings cloud your business judgment." "Personal feelings?" "Right." I laughed, but it came out sounding more bitter than amused. "My personal feelings about being pushed out of my own company by my wife and her strategic consultant. Nobody's pushing you out. We're evolving the company structure to match our growth trajectory. Using language like that doesn't make it less of a betrayal, Elara." The name hung between us like a challenge. We'd been using professional titles and careful distance for weeks now, but hearing her actual name seemed to cut through the corporate doublespeak. "Betrayal?" She leaned forward, and for a moment I saw something that looked like genuine emotion. "Kellan, I've spent 8 years building this company. 8 years of 18-hour days, missed vacations, postponed plans, everything sacrificed for this business. And now, when we're finally positioned for real success, you want to hold us back because you're uncomfortable with change. I want to be part of the decisions that affect the company I built. The company we built, past tense, what matters now is the company we're becoming. With Logan's help. Yes, with Logan's help. He brings expertise we don't have, connections we need, and strategic thinking that goes beyond the technical details you're so focused on. Strategic thinking, technical details, the language of dismissal, carefully chosen to make my contributions sound small and outdated. And the watch, Elara? Does Logan's strategic thinking extend to leaving his personal belongings in our laundry?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing options like a chess player considering her next move. "Logan and I work closely together," she said finally. "Sometimes that means long hours, late meetings, working dinners. If his watch ended up in our house, it's because we were reviewing documents in my home office. Until 2 in the morning? When necessary, yes. And last night's conference call with Tokyo? Was that also necessary?" Another pause, longer this time. I could see her realizing that I knew more than she'd assumed, calculating how much truth she could afford to admit. "Kellan, I think you're reading too much into routine business activities." "Routine business activities that happen to exclude the co-founder but include expensive gifts and overnight strategy sessions." She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot where my Mustang sat next to her BMW and Logan's Mercedes. 3 cars that told the story of 3 very different approaches to life. "What do you want me to say?" she asked without turning around. "I want you to tell me the truth." "The truth is that this company has outgrown what we used to be. The truth is that success requires different skills than we needed when we were starting out. The truth is that Logan understands the kind of leadership this company needs going forward. And I don't." She turned back to face me, and for the first time in months, I saw something in her expression that looked like the woman I'd married. "You're a good man, Kellan. You're honest and hardworking, and you care about doing things the right way, but caring isn't enough anymore. We need someone who can think strategically, who can navigate complex market dynamics, who can position us for optimal growth. Someone like Logan. Yes, someone like Logan." There it was. The truth I'd been avoiding and she'd been dancing around for months. I wasn't enough anymore. Not smart enough, not strategic enough, not whatever enough to deserve a place in the company I'd helped create. "And what about our marriage, Elara? Has that outgrown what we used to be too?" The question caught her off guard. I could see her switching from CEO mode to something more personal, more vulnerable. "Our marriage is separate from the business?" "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Logan's strategic consulting covers a lot of territory." She walked back to her desk and sat down, creating physical distance that matched the emotional gap that had been growing between us. "Kellan, if you can't separate your personal insecurities from legitimate business decisions, then maybe you're proving my point about your current contributions to this company. Personal insecurities. Current contributions." The language of corporate restructuring applied to a marriage that was apparently just another asset to be optimized. I stood up and walked toward the door, then stopped with my hand on the handle. "One last question," I said. When you and Logan finish restructuring everything I built, what exactly do you expect me to do? Applaud? Disappear? Crawl back and apologize for not being strategic enough? She looked at me across the expanse of her executive desk, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cold precision that had become her default tone. Honestly, Kellan, if you leave, you'll come crawling back to apologize, and when you do, I'll have replaced you in every sense that matters. The words hit like a physical blow, not just the content, but the casual certainty with which she delivered them. This wasn't anger or frustration. It was a calculated assessment of my worth and my options. We'll see, I said, and walked out of her office. The hallway felt different now, charged with the kind of clarity that comes after a long overdue conversation. I walked past the conference room where Logan was still presenting strategic initiatives to people who used to be my colleagues, past the offices where my contributions were being systematically erased, past the reception desk where Janet avoided making eye contact. I took the elevator down to the parking lot and sat in my Mustang for a few minutes, letting Elara's words replay in my mind. If you leave, you'll come crawling back. I'll replace you in every sense. The engine turned over with the reliable rumble of honest machinery. No strategic consulting required, no optimal positioning necessary, just fuel and spark, and the basic physics of internal combustion. I drove home through the midday traffic, past the office buildings and shopping centers that made up the landscape of our success. Everything looked the same as it had this morning, but somehow felt completely different. The house was empty when I arrived. Riley was at school, Elara was restructuring my life with Logan's help, and I was alone with the wreckage of assumptions I'd been carrying for months without examining. I poured myself a drink and sat in my study, looking at the partnership agreement that had once seemed like a foundation, but now felt more like a historical artifact. Equal partners, equal authority, equal responsibility for the future we were building together. I opened my laptop and started typing. The law office smelled like leather and old money, the kind of place where important documents were signed and life-changing decisions were made with expensive pens. I sat across from Patricia Reeves, the attorney who'd handled our original incorporation paperwork 8 years ago, watching her review the partnership agreement with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining x-rays. "This is quite comprehensive," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "You and your wife clearly thought through the contingencies when you drafted this." "We thought we were building something permanent. Most people do." She set the document down and leaned back in her chair. "The question is what you want to do about it now." I'd spent 3 days gathering documentation before making this appointment. Bank records, board meeting minutes, email threads, financial statements, everything I could access legally while I still had access to anything at all. The picture that emerged was clear, a systematic effort to diminish my role while strengthening Logan's position. "I want to understand my options," I said, "both for the business and for my marriage." Patricia nodded with the professional sympathy of someone who'd guided plenty of people through the wreckage of failed partnerships. "Let's start with the business. Based on what you've shown me, there are several concerning issues: the board restructuring, the equity discussions, the changes to operational authority. None of these appear to follow the procedures outlined in your partnership agreement." She pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making notes. "Your agreement requires unanimous consent for major structural changes. Has that been obtained?" "Not from me." "Then any decisions made without your approval are potentially invalid. However, enforcing that could be complicated if the other board members claim they were acting in the company's best interests." "Even if those board members were misled about the necessity of the changes?" "That would depend on what you can prove about their decision-making process." She looked up from her notes. "Do you have documentation of the discussions that led to these restructuring decisions?" I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording I'd made during yesterday's board meeting. Logan's voice came through clearly as he outlined his vision for streamlining leadership and optimizing operational efficiency. What he didn't mention was that his optimization plan involved reducing my authority while expanding his own. "Interesting," Patricia said when the recording ended. "Was everyone aware they were being recorded?" "It was announced at the beginning of the meeting. Standard practice for board meetings, according to our corporate governance policies." "Good. That makes it admissible if we need it." She made more notes. "What about the financial aspects? Any irregularities in compensation, expense accounts, or asset allocation?" I handed her a folder containing 6 months of financial records. "Logan's compensation package includes equity options that weren't approved through proper channels. Also, there have been significant expenses for strategic consulting that seem to correlate with his personal travel and entertainment." Patricia reviewed the documents with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd seen every variation of corporate malfeasance. "This is helpful. If we can establish a pattern of self-dealing or breach of fiduciary duty, it strengthens your position significantly. And my marriage? Her expression softened slightly. That's more complicated. I can recommend an excellent family law attorney, but I should warn you that divorce proceedings can get messy when significant business assets are involved. How messy? Depends on how cooperative your wife wants to be. If she's willing to negotiate fairly, you could potentially reach a settlement that protects both your business interests and your personal assets. If she decides to fight, she didn't need to finish the sentence. I'd heard enough divorce stories to understand the potential for mutual destruction when marriages ended badly. There's something else, I said, pulling out the photos I'd taken of Logan's watch and the corresponding receipt I'd found in Elara's car. I have reason to believe my wife is having an affair with Logan. Patricia studied the evidence with professional detachment. This could be relevant for the divorce proceedings, but it might also complicate the business issues. If we can establish that their relationship influenced business decisions, it could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. What's my next step? That depends on what you want to achieve. Do you want to save the marriage, save the business, or protect yourself from both? I'd been avoiding that question for weeks, but sitting in Patricia's office forced me to confront the reality I'd been dancing around. Elara had made her choice when she decided Logan's strategic thinking was more valuable than our partnership. She'd made it again when she restructured my role without consulting me, and she'd made it a third time when she told me I'd come crawling back after she replaced me. I want to protect what I built, I said, both the business and my relationship with my daughter. Then we need to move carefully but decisively. The longer you wait, the more time they have to further entrench their position. She outlined a strategy that was elegant in its simplicity. First, document everything, every decision made without proper authorization, every expense that couldn't be justified, every action that violated our partnership agreement. Second, use that documentation to force a proper board vote on the restructuring proposals. Third, trigger the valuation clause in our partnership agreement that would establish the company's worth based on current financials rather than projected growth. The valuation clause is particularly important, Patricia explained. If your wife wants to buy out your share, she has to pay fair market value as determined by an independent assessment. But if you trigger it now, before the IPO, the valuation will be based on current revenue rather than speculative future earnings. Meaning? Meaning she'd have to pay you half of what the company is worth today, not half of what she hopes it might be worth tomorrow. I left Patricia's office with a clear plan and a timeline that felt both urgent and liberating. For the first time in months, I was taking action instead of reacting to other people's strategic initiatives. The drive back to the office gave me time to think about what came next. Elara had assumed I'd accept my diminished role quietly, that I'd eventually adapt to whatever new reality she and Logan were creating. She'd underestimated both my attachment to what we'd built and my willingness to fight for it. The office felt different when I walked in, not because anything had changed, but because I was seeing it through new eyes. The security badges, the restructured meeting schedules, the subtle shifts in authority, they were all part of a larger pattern that became obvious once you knew what to look for. I spent the afternoon in my office, ostensibly working on routine business, but actually implementing Patricia's documentation strategy. Every email I'd missed because I wasn't included in the distribution list, every decision made in meetings I wasn't invited to attend, every expense approved without proper oversight, it all went into a file that painted a clear picture of systematic exclusion. The most damaging evidence came from the board meeting minutes I'd been able to access before my system permissions were updated. Logan had presented his restructuring proposal as necessary for investor confidence, claiming that potential funders were concerned about unclear leadership hierarchy. What he hadn't mentioned was that those same investors had never expressed any such concerns in their actual communications with the company. By 5 o'clock, I had enough documentation to support Patricia's strategy. The question now was timing. When to trigger the valuation clause, when to demand a proper board vote, when to confront Elara with evidence of what she and Logan had been doing. I was closing my laptop when Logan appeared in my doorway, his expensive suit and confident smile suggesting he'd had a successful day of strategic consulting. "Kellan, glad I caught you. Do you have a minute to chat?" "Sure. What's on your mind?" He closed the door and took the chair across from my desk, settling in with the casual comfort of someone who expected to be welcomed everywhere he went. I wanted to clear the air about yesterday's board meeting. I think there might have been some miscommunication about the restructuring proposal. Miscommunication? I realize it probably seemed like we were trying to sideline you, but that wasn't the intention. The goal is to position everyone for success as the company grows. I leaned back in my chair and studied his face, looking for tells that might reveal what he was really thinking. His expression was earnest, concerned, the perfect mask of someone who genuinely wanted to resolve a misunderstanding. Logan, can I ask you something? Of course. How long have you been planning this? Planning what? The restructuring, the equity redistribution, the systematic removal of my authority from the company I co-founded. His smile flickered just for a moment before reasserting itself. Kellan, I think you are misinterpreting routine corporate governance as something more sinister. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a carefully orchestrated takeover disguised as strategic planning. That's not what this is. Then what is it? He shifted in his chair, and I caught a glimpse of the calculation behind his concerned expression. It's business evolution. Companies that don't adapt to changing market conditions don't survive. And my role in this evolution? Your role is whatever you want it to be, within the framework of what's best for the company. As determined by you and Elara. As determined by the board, based on objective analysis of our operational needs. Objective analysis. I wondered if that's what they called their late-night strategy sessions, their intimate dinners, their careful coordination of my professional demise. Logan, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Okay. Are you having an affair with my wife? The question hit him like a physical blow. His careful composure cracked, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. That's completely inappropriate, Kellan. Elara and I work together. Our relationship is entirely professional. Professional relationships don't usually involve leaving personal items in each other's homes. I don't know what you're talking about. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the photo of his watch, setting it on the desk between us. Rolex Submariner. Inscription reads LM, time to succeed. Ring any bells? He stared at the photo for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Deny it and risk looking foolish when I produced more evidence, or admit it and try to control the narrative. Elara and I have been working closely on the IPO preparation, he said finally. Sometimes that involves working at her home office when confidential documents are involved. And the watch? I must have taken it off during one of those sessions. Easy to forget when you're focused on complex financial projections. Right, complex financial projections that require working until 2 in the morning. When necessary, yes. I picked up the photo and put it back in my drawer. Logan, I want you to understand something. I built this company from nothing. I know every client, every contract, every revenue stream that keeps the lights on. I also know every clause in our partnership agreement, including the ones that protect my interests when people try to restructure me out of my own business. His mask was fully back in place now, but I could see the wariness behind his eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to play corporate politics, you'd better make sure you understand the rules of the game. Is that a threat? It's a clarification. You've been operating under the assumption that I'd accept whatever changes you and Elara decided to implement. That assumption was incorrect. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the parking lot where our 3 cars sat in their assigned spaces. His Mercedes, her BMW, my Mustang. 3 different approaches to success, 3 different value systems, 3 different ideas about what mattered most. Logan, let me give you some free strategic consulting, I said without turning around. The foundation of any successful business is trust between partners. When that trust breaks down, everything else becomes unstable. What does that have to do with anything? It means that if you're going to restructure someone out of their own company, you'd better make sure they don't have the documentation to prove you violated your fiduciary duties in the process. I heard him shift in his chair, probably trying to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. Kellan, I think you're overcomplicating this. The restructuring proposal is designed to benefit everyone, including you. By reducing my equity and eliminating my operational authority. By aligning ownership with current contributions. Current contributions. I turned back to face him. Tell me, Logan, what exactly have you contributed to this company besides strategic advice and expensive dinners with my wife? I've brought institutional knowledge, market connections, and operational expertise that what? That justifies taking half of what I spent 8 years building? Nobody's taking anything from you. Aren't you? The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I saw something honest in his expression, not the calculated concern or the professional sympathy, but the simple recognition that we both knew exactly what was happening here. Kellan, business is about adapting to changing circumstances. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions about leadership and ownership structures, and sometimes it means honoring the agreements you made with the people who trusted you. I walked back to my desk and sat down, opening my laptop with the casual confidence of someone who held better cards than his opponent realized. Logan, I'm going to make you an offer. What kind of offer? The kind that gives you a chance to end this conversation with your reputation intact. He leaned forward, and I could see him calculating the risks and benefits of whatever I was about to propose. I'm listening. Resign from the company. Tonight. Take whatever severance package seems reasonable and walk away from the restructuring proposal. And if I don't? Then tomorrow morning I'm filing a formal complaint with the board about your breach of fiduciary duty, your inappropriate relationship with my wife, and your systematic violation of our corporate governance policies. You can't prove any of that. Can't I? I opened a folder on my desktop and turned the laptop screen toward him. 6 months of financial records, email threads, meeting minutes, and expense reports. Everything Patricia and I had identified as evidence of improper conduct. Logan, you're good at strategic thinking, but you're terrible at covering your tracks. Did you really think nobody would notice the correlation between your personal travel expenses and Elara's business trips? Or the fact that your equity options were approved in a board meeting that didn't have proper quorum? His face had gone pale, and I could see him realizing that his careful planning had left a trail of evidence that any competent attorney could follow. What do you want? I want you to disappear from my company and my marriage, tonight. And if I agree, then this conversation never happened, and you get to start over somewhere else with your reputation intact. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the laptop screen that displayed the evidence of his own strategic miscalculations. You're making a mistake, Kellan. Elara doesn't want to save your marriage. She wants to move forward with someone who understands her ambitions. That's between Elara and me. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like she's already made her choice. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. Logan, you have 1 hour to clean out your office and submit your resignation. After that, I start making phone calls to board members. He stood up slowly, his confident demeanor replaced by the careful movements of someone who just realized he'd been outmaneuvered. This isn't over. Yes, it is. I watched him walk toward the door, then called out just as he reached for the handle. Logan, one more thing. He turned back, and I could see the anger he'd been suppressing finally showing through his professional mask. Leave the watch on your desk when you go. The resignation letter was brief and professional, citing personal reasons for Logan's immediate departure from the company. He'd left it on Elara's desk along with his company laptop, security badge, and the Rolex submariner that had started this whole unraveling. I found Elara in her office at 7:30 the next morning, staring at Logan's resignation letter like it was written in a foreign language. She looked up when I knocked, her expression cycling through surprise, anger, and calculation in the space of a few seconds. What did you do? I had a conversation with Logan about his future with the company. What kind of conversation? I closed the door and took the chair across from her desk, noting that she'd moved the Rolex to her top drawer but hadn't bothered to hide it completely. The kind where he realized his strategic consulting services were no longer needed. She set the resignation letter down and leaned back in her chair, studying me with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a complex problem. You threatened him. I presented him with information about his performance and let him draw his own conclusions. What information? I pulled out a copy of the documentation I'd compiled, the financial records, the email threads, the meeting minutes that painted a clear picture of systematic impropriety, the kind that shows a pattern of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. Also, the kind that demonstrates how his personal relationship with you influenced business decisions. She glanced at the documents without picking them up, and I could see her calculating how much damage they might cause. Personal relationship? Elara, we both know what's been happening. The question is whether you want to discuss it honestly or continue pretending this is all about strategic business planning. Logan and I work closely together. That doesn't constitute a personal relationship. Working closely together until 2 a.m, taking business trips that happen to coincide with romantic getaways, restructuring the company to benefit your strategic consultant at the expense of your business partner? She stood up and walked to the window, the same position she'd taken during our last serious conversation. But this time I had documentation, leverage, and a clear understanding of what I was fighting for. What do you want, Kellan? I want you to honor the partnership agreement we signed 8 years ago. Which means what exactly? Which means reversing the unauthorized changes to the company structure, restoring my operational authority, and proceeding with the IPO under the original ownership distribution. She turned back to face me, and I could see her shifting into negotiation mode, the same focused intensity she brought to difficult client meetings. And if I refuse, then I trigger the valuation clause and force a buyout at current market value. Current market value is significantly less than our projected post-IPO worth. I'm aware of that. The implications hung between us like a challenge. If I forced a valuation now, before the IPO, she'd have to pay me half of what the company was currently worth. A substantial amount, but far less than what my share might be worth after going public. It was a nuclear option that would cost us both millions in potential future earnings. You'd destroy everything we built just to prove a point? I'd protect what we built from people who want to steal it. She walked back to her desk and sat down, her expression suggesting she was weighing options I couldn't see. Kellan, let me be clear about something. Logan's resignation doesn't change the fundamental issues with your role in this company. Which issues are those? Your inability to think strategically about our growth trajectory, your resistance to necessary operational changes, your focus on technical details instead of market positioning. My insistence on honoring our partnership agreement, your refusal to adapt to changing business requirements. I leaned forward and placed the partnership agreement on her desk, open to the section that outlined decision-making authority. Elara, this document requires unanimous consent for major structural changes. Did you get my consent for the equity redistribution? We were still discussing the details. Did you get my consent for restructuring operational authority? Those changes were recommended by the board. A board that was misled about the necessity of the changes and the potential consequences of implementing them. She picked up the partnership agreement and reviewed the relevant sections, probably looking for loopholes or alternative interpretations. The board has fiduciary responsibility to act in the company's best interests. Even when those actions violate the foundational agreements that created the company? Foundational agreements can be modified when circumstances change, with unanimous consent, which you didn't obtain. I could see her realizing that her legal position was weaker than she'd assumed. The partnership agreement was comprehensive and clearly written, and any attempt to circumvent its requirements would be difficult to justify in court. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we honor the agreement we made when we trusted each other enough to build something together. And Logan? Logan is no longer relevant to this conversation. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing the costs of different approaches. Fight me in court and risk exposing the improper relationship that had influenced her business decisions, or negotiate a settlement that preserved her control while acknowledging my rights. Both case. If I agree to restore the original company structure, what guarantee do I have that you won't interfere with operational decisions? The same guarantee you've always had, that I'll act in the company's best interests according to my best judgment. Your judgment hasn't always aligned with optimal business outcomes. My judgment built this company from nothing. My judgment secured our first major contracts. My judgment established the operational systems that still generate most of our revenue. That was 8 years ago, Kellan. The business environment has changed. The fundamentals haven't. Trust between partners, honoring agreements, making decisions based on facts instead of personal relationships. Those fundamentals are still relevant. She set the partnership agreement down and looked at me across the expanse of her executive desk. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the woman I'd married. Brilliant, ambitious, but also capable of recognizing when she'd made a mistake. If I agree to your terms, I want something in return. What? I want you to commit to the IPO timeline. No delays, no additional demands, no attempts to renegotiate our agreement again. Agreed? With one condition? Which is? All future major decisions get made according to the process outlined in our partnership agreement. No more unauthorized restructuring, no more strategic consultants with undisclosed conflicts of interest, no more changes implemented without proper consent. She considered this for a moment, probably calculating whether she could live with the constraints of the agreement she'd signed 8 years ago. And our marriage? The question caught me off guard. We'd been discussing business issues for so long that the personal dimension felt almost secondary. What about our marriage? Do you want to save it? I looked at her across the desk that had become a symbol of the distance between us, thinking about the woman who used to stay up all night coding while I handled client calls, who used to celebrate contract wins with cheap champagne and expensive dreams. I want to save what's worth saving. Which is? I don't know yet, but I know it's not what we've become. She nodded slowly, and I could see her accepting the reality that our relationship, both business and personal, would have to be rebuilt from scratch. I'll have the board reverse the restructuring decisions, she said, and I'll restore your operational authority. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This doesn't solve our fundamental problems, Kellan. It just gives us a chance to address them properly. I stood up and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Elara, can I ask you something? What? When did you stop seeing me as your partner and start seeing me as an obstacle? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice carried something that sounded almost like regret. When I realized you were content with what we'd already built, and I wanted more. More what? More growth, more success, more recognition. More than what we could achieve together. The honesty was brutal and clarifying. She hadn't betrayed our partnership because she stopped caring about me. She'd betrayed it because she'd started caring more about what Logan could offer her. And now? Now I realize that more isn't always better. Sometimes it's just different. I left her office with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I'd won the immediate battle, Logan was gone, the unauthorized changes would be reversed, my rights under the partnership agreement would be restored, but the larger war for our marriage was far from over. The rest of the morning was spent in meetings with department heads, explaining Logan's departure and outlining the return to our original operational structure. The reactions were mixed, some relief from people who'd been uncomfortable with the rapid changes, some concern from those who'd bought into Logan's strategic vision. By noon, word had spread throughout the office that the corporate restructuring was being reversed and that I'd reasserted my authority as co-founder. The subtle power dynamics that had shifted over the past few months began shifting back, and I could feel the organizational balance returning to something that felt familiar. But familiarity wasn't the same as stability. The trust that had held our partnership together for 8 years had been damaged, and rebuilding it would require more than just reversing unauthorized policy changes. I was reviewing the quarterly financial reports when my phone rang. Patricia Reeves, calling with an update on the legal documentation I'd requested. "Good news," she said. "The partnership agreement is solid, and the board's actions were clearly outside their authority. If your wife tries to challenge the reversal, she doesn't have much legal ground to stand on." "She's not going to challenge it. We reached an agreement this morning." "Excellent. What about the personal issues?" "Still complicated." "They usually are, but you've protected your business interests, which gives you options for dealing with the personal side." After I hung up, I sat in my office looking at the photos on my desk. Images of our company's growth, our family's evolution, the gradual transformation from struggling entrepreneurs to successful business owners. The pictures told a story of partnership and shared ambition, but they also documented the slow drift that had brought us to this point. Around 3 o'clock, Elara appeared in my doorway. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the morning's conversation had forced her to confront realities she'd been avoiding. "The board meeting is scheduled for 5 o'clock, she said. "I'll be recommending that we reverse the restructuring decisions and restore the original operational framework." "Thank you." "Kellan, I want you to know that I never intended for things to get this complicated." "But they did get complicated." "Yes, they did." She stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and I could see her struggling with something she wanted to say but couldn't quite articulate. "What is it, Elara?" "I keep thinking about what you said yesterday, about coming crawling back." "What about it?" I realized I was talking about myself as much as you. If I'd continued down the path I was on, I would have ended up crawling back to apologize for destroying everything we built together. The admission hung between us, honest and painful, and surprisingly hopeful. "So where does that leave us?" "I don't know, but I know it leaves us with a chance to figure it out." The board meeting that evening was brief and unanimous. The restructuring proposals were formally withdrawn, my operational authority was restored, and Logan's resignation was accepted without discussion. By 6 o'clock, the corporate crisis was officially over, but as I drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, I realized that the personal crisis was just beginning. Elara and I had saved our business partnership, but we still had to decide whether our marriage was worth the same effort. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, not because anything had changed physically, but because the balance of power had shifted back towards something that felt more equitable. Riley was in the kitchen, doing homework at the counter where Elara and I used to plan our business strategy over takeout dinners. "Hey, Dad, Mom called and said you guys worked out the company stuff." "We did." "Does that mean things are going back to normal?" I looked around the kitchen with its expensive appliances and professional lighting, thinking about what normal might mean for a family that had grown apart while building something together. "I think it means we're going to figure out what normal should be." "Good," she said, returning to her homework. I was getting tired of all the weird tension around here. That evening, Elara and I sat in our living room for the first time in months, not discussing business strategy or family logistics, but simply trying to remember how to be in the same space without the weight of unresolved conflicts. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we decide whether we want to rebuild what we had or build something new. And if we can't agree on what to build, then we'll figure out how to separate what we've built fairly and respectfully." She nodded, and I could see her accepting the reality that our future, both personal and professional, would require conscious choices rather than default assumptions. Kellan, I owe you an apology. For what? For assuming you'd accept whatever changes I wanted to make, for treating our partnership like something I could restructure without your consent, for letting my ambition override my judgment about what really mattered. The apology was more than I'd expected and exactly what I'd needed to hear. Thank you. Does that change anything between us? It changes the foundation we're building from. Whether it changes the outcome depends on what we do next. We talked until midnight, not resolving anything definitively, but establishing a framework for the conversations that would determine our future. By the time we went to bed, in the same room for the first time in weeks, I felt cautiously optimistic about our chances. The next morning brought news that Logan had accepted a position with a competing firm, taking with him whatever strategic insights he'd developed during his brief tenure with our company. Elara seemed relieved rather than disappointed by his departure, which I took as a positive sign. 3 weeks later, she called me at the office with news that would test everything we'd rebuilt. Kellan, I just got off the phone with our lead investor. They want to move up the IPO timeline. How much? 6 weeks instead of 6 months. The accelerated timeline would require intensive preparation, long hours, and the kind of partnership that had made us successful 8 years ago. It would also test whether we could work together under pressure without falling back into the patterns that had nearly destroyed our relationship. What do you think? She asked. I think it's time to find out if we remember how to be partners. Are you willing to try? I looked out my office window at the parking lot where our cars sat side by side, her BMW, my Mustang, and the empty space where Logan's Mercedes used to be. Yes, I said. I'm willing to try. The line was quiet for a moment, and when Elara spoke again, her voice carried something I hadn't heard in months, genuine gratitude mixed with cautious hope. Thank you, Kellan, for fighting for what we built, for not giving up when it would have been easier to walk away. Thank you for remembering why we built it in the same place. 6 weeks later, our company went public at a valuation of $240 million. Elara and I rang the opening bell together, equal partners in the success we'd created and the future we were still learning how to build. The marriage took longer to repair, but the foundation we'd rebuilt in those crucial weeks proved strong enough to support the work of becoming partners again, not just in business, but in the more complicated enterprise of sharing a life together. And Logan? He lasted 6 months at his new company before being asked to resign for undisclosed reasons. I heard through industry contacts that his strategic consulting approach hadn't translated well to a firm that valued long-term relationships over short-term optimization. Sometimes the best revenge is simply outlasting the people who underestimate your commitment to what you've built.